All right, friends, welcome back. Jed and Dan here. We're talking about Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah. This is actually different for us because we're not doing direct kind of Bible exposition here, but we're talking about something it's important to a lot of people in our world today. It's important to history. And I would argue it's also important to understanding the New Testament, and maybe we'll talk some about that. I'm not sure exactly where our conversation will lead us here today, but I would argue that not understanding this time period really sets us back from understanding some of the thinking and the expectations that are going on when we turn to the pages of the New Testament. Would you agree with that?
I would, yeah, and you're right. What we're talking about is not something that is quote unquote in the Bible, but given what we're trying to do in this page and with the videos that we do, we are going to approach this story from the biblical perspective, or kind of where does this fit into the biblical story that we know. And so it has both those far-reaching effects for Jews around the world who are celebrating Hanukkah right now. Today is the fifth day of Hanukkah out of the 8 days. We'll talk about that. But it also has relevance for us as Bible readers and as Bible believers.
So Hanukkah isn't in the Bible at all?
Not the event itself, no.
It's interesting, which is what makes this different than all of the other Jewish holidays, festivals, most of which are really given and instructed by God, right, to follow throughout the Old Testament.
Exactly.
This one's a little bit different,
right?
So in that way, you could say, I don't know if you could say it's not that it's less important, but it's not one of the major kind of feasts typically, but it's become, I think, more important in Jewish practice over the years. So it does show up in one little tiny place in the Bible in the New Testament in John chapter 10, where it's mentioned the Feast of Dedication. So that's what Hanukkah actually means, and we'll talk about why it's called that. So it was something that was acknowledged and practiced in the time of Jesus, even though it's not a major thing in the New Testament. That's, I believe, the only reference in the Bible at all to it. But that one little reference gives us an idea that is something that was.
We at least know that they were aware of it, and that it was something that they were doing at that time.
Right. Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
So back us up a little bit. What do you feel like we need to know that's happening before the events that lead up to Hanukkah? Well,
sure.
The reason why we remember
Hanukkah. Right. So again, being Bereans and trying to situate this within the Bible, that's what I'm going to do. So within most English translations of the Bible, there's a blank page in between what we consider the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay. Now, at one level, Dan, and this would be another fun discussion for us to have, I think we should rip that page out of our Bibles. I think that page does us a disservice because it suggests there's two different stories. There's the Old Testament, read that start to finish. Okay, blank page. Now we're moving on to something completely different, to use the Monty Python expression.
Yeah.
And then we get into the New Testament. And if we rip that page out, it suggests, no, there's continuity, which, of course, you and I have talked a lot about that need for continuity.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't love the old. I kind of like, so sometimes people say, the First Testament. And
right. That's a John Golden Gay.
I mean, it's not, it's not really worked its way in there, but there is something about that we can kind of say this is something different, but it's one story.
Right. Certainly our Jewish friends are going to use the Hebrew Bible, right? That is their Bible. So sometimes referring it to as the Hebrew Bible, and then the New Covenant or the New Testament.
Which people should know, if they don't, it's the same thing with different language. Or what we call the Old Testament, Jewish folks, is their only testament. They call it the Hebrew Bible typically.
Right.
So
So the benefit of that blank page, the reason that I still have mine in my New Testament, or I'm sorry, in my Bible, is because it's a reminder to us that there are 400 years of history in between Malachi, which ends, again, the Old Testament, whatever we want to call it, and the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. And it's helpful to remember, wow, a lot happened in that time frame. So the reason I start there is because it's within that 400-year time period that Hanukkah, or the reason for celebrating Hanukkah, begins. Now, the one other piece that I would kind of add in as backdrop is Alexander the Great. Dude is sort of everywhere at this time. He's enormously important. But why are our New Testaments written in Greek? Why is Greece such a big player, even by the time we get to Jesus? Why is it that there's such a thing as the Hellenists? We read about them throughout the New Testament, these Jews that have this Greek influence. All of these questions take us straight back to this guy named Alexander the Great. Who started from a relatively small portion of Greece up in Macedonia and pretty much took over the known world. The sort of a one-man wrecking crew gathered an army around him and takes over the world and brings Greek culture and language and everything else with him. Of course, then when the Romans take over, they want to make everything Roman, but they also say, hey, the Greeks had a lot going for them. We're going to incorporate a lot of this Greek culture into what we're doing. And so it stays even into our New Testament days. When Alexander dies, the Greek empire starts to split and faction, and who's going to be the next leader, and how's that all going to work. And there are several kind of players that rise to the surface, several different factions, one of which are the Seleucids. And now we're kind of narrowing in on Hanukkah and getting close to that. So we are talking, if you want to use round numbers, about 200 BC. So halfway through that 400-year period in your blank page. Dan, you might be able to help me with the exact numbers. I think Antiochus rises 176.
Yeah, you're in the ballpark. I don't recall the
exact
week, but
so anyways, there's this leader of the Seleucids known as Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And he and the Seleucids are fighting against another group of Greeks called the Ptolemies. And that starts with a P, the Ptolemies, but this other Greek group. And poor little Israel is kind of caught in the middle, as they often are. And if you think through Old Testament history, Israel's always being taken over from someone, right? The Assyrians sweep in, and then the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians, and now we have the Greeks coming in. And as the Greeks are fighting against each other, Israel's caught right in the middle there. So Antiochus rises, he defeats the Ptolemies, he takes control. And part of that means he takes control of Israel and specifically Jerusalem. Antiochus is about as evil as they come. Dan, maybe we'll do some more discussion with this as well, but I think he shows up a couple different times in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 8 and in chapter 11, and a lot of the prophecies that I think tend to get lumped in with the idea of end times destruction, that actually seems to line up pretty consistently with Antiochus.
Josephus thought so. I was just reading some of
Okay.
He actually tied in Daniel. One thing I want to just pause on for a second and mention is that, in the big picture of God's people, right? So they're in exile, the southern kingdom of Judah, right, is in Babylon, and they're allowed to return under the Persians. But from exile until now, what we're talking about, they never have their own self really rule again. They're always under, and you mentioned the different before Alexander, his successors, they're always under somebody else's really rule. There's not been any independent, and that's important for the big picture of Berean story, because God made promises about a king, a descendant of David, and other promises that are kind of hanging out there.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
But the other thing is that most of these other empires, if you will, allowed Jews to be Jews, basically, without a lot of, they pretty much, anybody that was in charge, they wanted taxes. That was kind of part of the deal. Give us money to help to fund the furtherance of our empire, etc. But for the most part, they were allowed to do their thing. They had their temple, they had their sacrifices, they had their laws, they had their ways. And so it was not wonderful because they weren't, entirely independent, but it was enough that they could follow God. Right. And God's will and God's ways until this moment. And that's where it becomes a crisis point. But the other thing in the background with Alexander and Hellenism is that, Alexander didn't come in and said, hey, you got to stop being Jewish, stop doing this, stop to do this instead. But he really infiltrated all that Greek culture, which was very different in a way. And so God's people, the Jewish people, had to really reckon with, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Should we kind of go along with this? Should we go all in on it? Should we totally resist it? And different people had different ideas of that.
Right.
Some Jews were all in on Hellenism.
Sure.
And
realizing that part of Hellenism meant really good art.
Yeah.
Really impressive sculpting. These kinds of things we say, well, it's beautiful. This is something that we can enjoy. I might not worship the Greek gods, but I'm interested in the art that the Greeks can. It took over every element of society.
Right. Yeah. In the gymnasiums and stuff like that. So they would add these things, and some people thought that was a good thing, some people didn't. But this is also a fascinating period of history, Judd, for us to think about how do the people of God, if you will, respond to other things in culture. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they indifferent? Whatever. Like they were dealing with that then, just like we have to continually deal with that as new ideas and new things come along. We have to evaluate, as God's people, should we just embrace this? Should we say, I'm not sure, maybe, should we reject it? And so these periods of history are really interesting for us to think about that today.
Absolutely.
So Antiochus, and I'll let you jump back into the discussion here. So Antiochus, though, is a game changer in not foreign rule, but the way that he's going to come in and impose a different way.
Right. So as Dan, as you were saying, a lot of these foreign rulers are giving the Jewish people some latitude in, okay, you can be Jews, just pay us the taxes, that kind of thing. That's not what happens under the Seleucids. Antiochus takes over Israel, takes over the temple. Now we're talking about the second temple, right? Solomon's temple has been destroyed hundreds of years earlier. The people returning rebuilt the temple. And Antiochus goes into the temple, and there's some question about the specifics of this. Again, because it's not as though we can say, oh, turn to this biblical book and here's the whole story. We get bits and pieces. Either sets up a statue to Zeus, it might be an altar to Zeus inside the temple. Inside the very place where God's people are to worship Yahweh, and institutes sacrifices to Zeus, and just sort of to be mean, just as an extra jab against the Jewish people, the animals that are sacrificed are pigs, which of course are unclean animals according to the Levitical law, and Antiochus is just being a jerk. That's what it boils down to. He knows how painful this is going to be for the Jewish people.
And we know how painful that would be, because we know to the extent that we know our Old Testament. So this is not just about cultural things that develop, but we can turn through the pages of Scripture and know, that it's offense upon offense. You mentioned the sacrifice, but just we have this whole thing about who can even enter the temple and when and how and only the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement gets to enter the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary of the temple. And there's all these things that need to be done, and here this person just says, "Screw you guys, I'm walking
just
in there."
Walks right in. Yeah.
So how do we know? You mentioned some things that we're not sure about. So how do we know what we know about this stuff? I think it's good for people to know this, because then they can have opportunity to do some further inquiry themselves. What are sort of the sources?
Yeah, and you'll probably be able to answer your own question better than I can. But the two resources that we can start with, there are, I guess you could call them two books, but in some way one book of the Maccabees. If you're familiar at all with within the Catholic Bible, there are a number of books that appear in the Old Testament or the First Testament that do not appear in the Protestant Bible. Two of these are First and Second Maccabees, which tells a lot of the history of this time period that we're talking about, 170s, 160s BC. And in just a moment, we'll talk about why they're named Maccabees. So those books are certainly very interesting history, give us a sense of what's going on at this time period, these kinds of things that we're talking about. The other resource, and Dan, you already mentioned him briefly, is a man by the name of Josephus. Now, Josephus is writing most of 200 years, or a little over 200 years, after these events have taken place. But Josephus is a Jewish traitor, Benedict Arnold, if you will. He's a Jewish general during the time, now the Romans are in charge. So after the New Testament time period, Josephus writes about Jesus also. So one of the reasons that pretty much everyone's in agreement that Jesus was at the very least a historical figure is because you have Josephus, who doesn't believe Jesus is anything special, but he's at least writing about, hey, there's this guy Jesus who's around. In any case, Josephus is a Jewish general who realizes that the wars against Rome are not going well. Israel's not going to come out on top. And so he actually switches sides. He goes over to the Romans. But he writes a pretty comprehensive history of the Jewish people. And he gives us some at least glimpses of these kinds of things that we're talking about as well. Yeah. Obviously, Alexander, because of how special he was, he had a lot of biographers and historians who are writing about him as well in his own lifetime. Now, you get into some of the fun stuff with that too, because Alexander believed that he was a god. He believed that he was a son of Hercules. And if you're Alexander's biographer, what are you going to do? Say, no, I don't think that's right. Well, you lose your head if you do that. So you say, of course you're the son of Hercules. So you get these kinds of fun details included in the histories as well. But
So that's kind of our primary source material, and it's available. I mean, if you want to learn more about this, those are the places to look. Josephus, The Antiquities of the Jews, is the name of his long book, and then he's written other things as well too. But it's a massive work. But you mentioned the Apocrypha that you mentioned is a primary source, of course, for this as well. And that blank page in your Bible, as you mentioned, and some editions, particularly for Roman Catholics, is not a blank page. It's all these books, these and more, which for various reasons we're not going to talk about today, we don't accept as scripture, but they are helpful for understanding this period of time and kind of filling in that filling in that gap. So back into our story and what you were mentioning about Antiochus. Let me just give a little snapshot from this is First Maccabees, and I suggest really on my mind this morning is for Hanukkah. I would recommend that everybody read the first 4 chapters of First Maccabees to really get a good sense of this. You can find it online, I'm sure, for free. I believe in Bible translations, it's really only available in the King James and the NRSV,
Right.
Are the primary ones. So let me just give a snapshot of Antiochus here. This is his first kind of major foray into causing big problems. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary. This is, if you want to find it, this is First Maccabees chapter 1, verse 21. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He took also the table of the bread of the presence, the cups for the drink offering, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the gold decorations in front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the gold and the silver and the costly vessels, and he took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he went into his own land. So that's the first thing before the sacrifices and all that. He came and he just stripped the temple of everything. That in and of itself, Chet, is enough to really,
And if you're reading the history of the Jewish people or the biblical history, this should remind you of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who does the exact same thing in the late 6th century BC. Right, when Babylon sweeps in and destroys the first temple, this is the exact same thing they're doing. They walk inside this temple. Wow, there's a lot of gold in here. Hey, look at that big golden box. Let's take that gold, right? And so when we see Antiochus doing this same kind of thing, I always want to say Antiochus. I think that's
the pronunciation. I was going to say, I picked up on that. I say Antiochus, but it can go either way, I think.
Right. And it's one of those things when you read a name more than you hear it,
it's hard to say. Yeah.
So when Antiochus is doing that, he's replicating what Nebuchadnezzar has already done.
Yeah. Yep. And it gets worse, I want to say, in a way. So there's kind of 2 related aspects to what Antiochus does. One is just this total desecration of the temple first. And it's interesting because as the narrative goes on in First Maccabees, it picks up 2 years later. So he does this, he rips all this stuff out and down, and it's gone. And then 2 years elapse to when he comes back around, and now a ton more problems happen. So this is a long time brewing and working and happening. But he proceeds from there to not only disgrace the temple, the whole deal, to really seeking to eradicate Jewish practice from the land by law and completely. And that is really the case where the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. It's probably not a good analogy. So if there's nothing else in the middle of that you want to read, let me just read just a couple more sentences of what that looked like, just to set the stage for the people's response to what's going on here. So this is in First Maccabees 1:41. You can see just the first chapter. It's pretty long, but has a lot of this information about it. So he writes that the whole kingdom should all be one people. So he wants them all to have the same beliefs, the same ideas, the same practices Antiochus does, and that they should all give up their particular customs. And he sends letters by messengers to Jerusalem, to the towns of Judea, and directed them to follow strange customs to them. So here's the specifics, and I want people to realize this and pick up on this. And verse 45 here, First Maccabees 1, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary. So outlawing the sacrificial system. Okay, to profane Sabbaths and festivals. Right, these are the big pillars of Jewish practice. Right, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. Woo! They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so this is interesting. Here's the purpose, according to this document, verse 49, so that they would forget the law and change all of their ordinances, right? So no sacrifice to idols, no circumcision, right? No, all these things. And whoever, verse 15 here, he added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. Little threat there.
Just put your life on the line for this stuff.
So this is really, I don't know what the word is for it, right? Antiochus is trying to pretty much eradicate Judaism,
right?
Biblical practice. So how will the people respond to that?
Right. So we mentioned Josephus, so I'll just hold up. You can get, Dan mentioned it's big. It is.
Small too.
This guy wrote a lot, but you can get kind of his whole works in one volume too. So.
Yeah.
All right. So
you want to tell us about Matthias, or you got something else going?
Yep. No. So we've got this seed bed of things are about as bad as they can get. And then there's also this, for several hundred years, we haven't had a king. We haven't been self-ruled. What about God's promises? And there's a man, a family. The patriarch of this family is named Matthias Maccabee. He's got 5 sons, and I believe it's 4 or 5. And he's sort of had enough with everything that's going on. And so he and his family essentially start a revolt against the Seleucids. Kind of start small, builds. They're always wildly outnumbered. I don't know exact numbers, but I think the Maccabees might get as many as 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers that are following them. The Seleucids have tens upon tens of thousands of soldiers at their disposal.
You're so bad at skipping the fun details for the big picture.
All right, give us some fun details.
So here's how, and this is recounted, and actually these books, and Josephus even more, has way more detail about all these things than you would ever want to know about about all the battles and blah 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 and this. But this moment is a poignant moment with Matthias. So I just read that edict that Antiochus sent out. So they went to all the towns, the Seleucid officials, and erected these altars and demanded that people offer these sacrifices, right? These swine and whatever it was, but they were sacrificing to pagan idols, Zeus, if you will, etc. So they come in Matthias and they said, "Hey, you're the head of this household. You do this, so everybody else will do it too." And he says, "No, I won't do it. I'm not going to do it. I'd rather." And he later evokes Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in that situation, and says, we have to follow God. We can't do this, right? So somebody else in the town says, "Well, I'll offer the sacrifice." Another Jewish person there says, "Well, I'll offer the sacrifice for him." And Matthias is so filled with this righteous zeal, this anger, that he kills this fellow Jew that does it. He kills the Seleucid official that's there, and he says, "Everybody who's zealous for the law, follow me." And we're going. And that's the beginning of this. What you were telling there. And so they became this kind of band of guerrilla kind of warfare and grew from there, right?
You just want all the gory details included.
Well, it's gory. It's gorier than that even, maybe. But
yeah.
So they're saying, this is it. We're done. Right. We're done with this stuff. We're gonna take our whatever back.
Right.
So
Matthias certainly is the spearhead of this, but one of his sons sort of rises to the fore, Judah, one of them. And He's Judah Maccabee, but you'll often see his name as Judas Maccabeus. And I'll be honest, I don't know if that's a Latinized version of his name that came in with the Romans, or if it's an Anglicized version that came in with Shakespeare. And it may be a little bit of both, but you'll see his name both ways, either Judah Maccabee or Judas Maccabeus. But
so the Maccabee means the hammer. It's kind of a nickname,
right?
That's given to.
Well, it's a family name, I think.
No,
is it not?
No, it's not. There.
Okay.
The family name relates to the Hasmonean word that's used for their dynasty. But I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure, because specifically only Judah is associated with the Maccabee, not the other brothers.
Okay.
So they become known as their extended family kind of comes under that name, but it's not official. It's kind of more colloquial. That it kind of comes. That's my understanding anyway. I could be wrong.
Okay, sure.
So in any case, but it's significant because this idea of the hammer, it kind of relates to the the approach that he had to dealing with this with the threat.
Right. So at the risk of infuriating Dan, I'm going to fast forward 4 years.
You got to do it eventually.
So over the space of 168 BC to 164 BC, the Maccabees, those that are following them, are fighting these wars against Antiochus, against the Seleucids, guerrilla tactics, hit and run kind of thing, small skirmishes. But it culminates in 164 with a fairly decisive defeat in which they drive the Seleucids out, drive Antiochus out. I think maybe even Antiochus is killed in battle, though I'm not positive about that. I know he dies.
But it's not in battle with them. I think it's
okay.
Somewhere else.
Yeah, and you know, and he's trying to control the whole world at this point, so he's everywhere.
Yeah.
But the Maccabees, the Jewish people, enter the temple to cleanse it, to clean it out, to get rid of the false idols, to drive from it. And I'm using these words very intentionally, to drive from the temple the foreign invaders. The reason I'm using those words very intentionally is because we have a picture in the Gospels of Jesus arriving at the temple and driving from the temple those influences which are in it. So the messianic, I won't even say undertones, they're very overt. The things that Jesus is doing in the Gospels, there's a lot of similarities to what Judah and his followers are doing 200 years earlier. So there's a lot of expectation. What is God's Messiah going to do if not drive out the foreign invaders and reestablish temple worship? And so there's a lot of expectation that Judah, is he the next king? Is he the Messiah? Is God's hand upon this to finally free us from the foreign invaders? It certainly feels that way because things are going very well. So Judah is able to come into the temple, drive it out, tear down these false idols, cleanse it, take out the pigs that are being there. Any of the priests who have been participating in this false worship within the temple, they're driven from it. They're actually killed. It's quite a violent response that the Maccabees undertake. And so now here's where we're getting to Hanukkah. Okay, so Hanukkah is the half hour later we made it.
But here's the thing, I don't know if I want to compare it or not, but because of all of the expectations waiting for the coming of Jesus, is sort of like all of this background sets up how significant this was to them. It wasn't just like, oh hey, they had kind of compromised a little bit, but we got them back on track. Like this is like, it feels like all is lost.
Right. And
now it's by miracle, seemingly, right? It's back.
Right.
So.
Right. So going back to Leviticus just for a moment, we'll get to Hanukkah. So we remember that anything that's used in the temple is holy. And as much as we tend to consider the word holy to mean righteously good, that's not what the word holy means. Holy means set apart. So if you have a spoon that's holy, it doesn't mean that it's a morally good spoon. It means this is a spoon that's only going to be used for a specific purpose, right? So in the temple, they would have all these holy elements, bowls and spoons, all those things that Antiochus took. Those were holy elements that were only supposed to be used for the temple. And one of those things was oil for the candelabra that was in the temple. There was a lighting system there, and only holy oil could be used to light this candelabra. Now, the way the story goes, that's the terminology I'll use, and then we'll talk about it. But the way the story goes is that when Judah and the others enter the temple and cleanse it out, and they want to light the candelabra, there's only enough oil to light the candelabra for one day. And they need to make more oil to light the candelabra. But because this is going to be a holy oil, it's going to be you can't just grab any oil off the shelf and say, oh, we'll just use that oil until we get the good stuff. No, this has to be holy oil. You can only use the set apart oil that's been made in the correct way. That's going to take 8 days to make, but they only have enough oil for one day. So they light the candelabra saying, all right, at least we'll get one day, and I don't know what we're going to do for the other 7 days, but we're waiting for this other oil to be made. As the story goes, miraculously, this oil lasts for 8 days. Kind of an Elijah with the widow type scenario, where the jar of oil and the meal doesn't run out. It just continues to burn for 8 days until more holy oil can be made. And so the celebration of Hanukkah, big picture, is celebrating Judah Maccabee and his followers driving out the Seleucids, cleansing the temple, restoring worship in Jerusalem. But specifically, it's recounting this miracle in which the light is kept burning for 8 days. And that's the reason behind the Jewish menorah. I have one in front of me here, so I'll hold up. So you
very rough looking one.
Yep. It said lots of years of wax dripping down it.
Did you chop that log in half by yourself too?
I sure did. Yep.
Wow. What a freaking Maccabee you are.
Used a hammer and everything.
I don't know what the Hebrew word for the axe is, but that'll be you.
Yep. Yep. So when our family celebrates Hanukkah, we light the candle each night, and this is the one we use. So there are 9 candles on the menorah, 8 of them, and the reason that I have 6 here is because we are going to be celebrating the 5th night of Hanukkah tonight. So this is set up for tonight. So 5 of these candles represent the 5 days that we've celebrated so far. There's a candle in the middle, which is called the shamus. That can be translated as the helper candle or the assistant candle, that kind of thing. And that's the candle that you use to light all the others. That's the tradition, and so that's how it goes. So each night you light one more successive candle. So the first night there was just one candle. Whoops. There was just one candle that we lit.
You make a bad priest, John.
The second night, 2, so on and so forth, until the whole thing is lit.
That's good. So the other aspect of the 8, though, too, I believe, is that when the tabernacle and then the temple are dedicated, there's an 8-day celebration or process of that. So I think that they're also, as those were kind of put in place, now they're thinking, okay, we're reestablishing this temple, so we're going to do the 8-day thing. I think that gives extra significance to the 8 days, besides just the timeline or
Sure.
kind of a randomness or that kind of thing. So Hanukkah is called the Feast of Dedication, right?
Right.
So dedication is the core idea. The interesting thing, and I hadn't really looked that much into this until recently, but the interesting thing is that in Josephus and in these books of Maccabees, the miracle of the lights isn't there, of the oil rather, sort of lasting. So it's interesting to sort of think about that. In any case, I don't know that it's necessarily neither here nor there, but I think it's important in this, and I think a lot of rabbis and stuff, whatever, that really are into it would say this, that it's the rededication of itself. The fact that these people could kind of actually take on this major Greek army and win and rededicate the temple to God, this rededication, that's the core of it. Right. The aspect of the miracle of the oil, we don't know exactly when came up, and there's a lot of discussion about it, which is really interesting to kind of know and to wonder about, whatever. But it's interesting stuff.
Yeah. So then the final piece that I think it's very important to say is that so now we've got Judah Maccabee is certainly the leader. I don't know that he's ever crowned king. So
he's not. Speak. No, his brother though is Simon eventually.
Right, but there's a sense of our guy is here. We've got a leader, we've got a ruler, we've got a temple. Things are going well, and for most of 100 years, the Maccabee family and then those that succeed from them are, for all intents and purposes, ruling Jerusalem, and things are looking pretty good.
They are, yeah.
Until the Romans come in and smush that, and now there's sort of this devastation all over again of, wait a minute, we thought God had sent his Messiah, we thought things were going our way, we thought we had our king. What now? When is God finally going to send his Messiah? And that, of course, is the seedbed, and that's why this history is so important for us as Christians, is because that is then, and it still takes 60 more years from there, but that's the seedbed and the culmination of anticipation, that then we turn the page from this blank page to Matthew chapter 1 and the introduction to Jesus, and the people who are desperately waiting. We thought that David was it. We thought Judah Maccabee was it. We're still waiting. We're still looking.
Except for none of the Maccabees can be it, because they're in the wrong family.
Right.
Which is interesting, because it's sort of almost like, well, we like this guy and what he's doing enough that
well kind
of, you know what I mean? It's kind of like
wink, nod.
But it's really, I think in the big picture story, Judd, it's extremely important that God promised David that he would have a descendant of his family line, right? In the tribe of Judah would be the Messiah.
So Judah Maccabee is not from the tribe of Judah.
Right.
I believe he's a Levite.
Well, yes, they're Levites, because Mattathias is a priest.
Right.
His father. And so Judah actually gets killed along the way, and then Simon becomes kind of the first, one of his brothers in that kind of kingly rule. And it also, fast forwarding a lot in Jesus's life to the triumphal entry, there's an interesting thing. Let me just read this quick. This is from First Maccabees chapter 13. On the 23rd day of the second month, and the 171st year, the Jews entered the city with praise and with palm branches, and with harps and cymbals and stringed instruments, and with hymns and songs, because a great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel. And Simon decreed that every year they should celebrate this day with rejoicing. So this is fascinating. We have this military conquering king entering the city of Jerusalem with palm branches and singing and excitement. Fast forward, right, to Jesus entering the city. Now we're in a different holiday season from us right now. But what were people expecting when they were welcoming Jesus into the city? I think this is very much in their minds.
Absolutely. He's going to go to the temple and he's going to drive out the foreign invaders.
Yeah.
Right? So Jesus arrives in the city, rides into palm branches, goes to the temple, and drives out the wrong people. He's not driving out the Romans. He's driving out the money changers, right? Oh, he doesn't agree. I love it.
I mean, that's part of it. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Haha, he's convinced. Okay. So where I'm going with this is that Jesus does not arrive in Jerusalem and say, I'm another Judah Maccabees who's going to start a fight against Rome. He says, no, I'm going to change from within. And the way that you're doing temple worship, right? This commerce that's taking place of having to change the money and buy the sacrifices, Jesus says, we're not doing it that way anymore. And of course, then where he goes with that is I'm the temple. This is where worship is going to center, right?
And when he says that, they're like, yeah, we're losing enthusiasm.
Right.
But you know who is much more into that? Barabbas. He's would join the Maccabees. He's ready to go, and people like him better than Jesus. So I think this is significant background for a lot of that, and for a lot of expectations. So we may not know these things just reading the Bible, but this is more recent history. I mean, it's not right there, but this is like we think about like the time of like the founding of our country. Maybe similar-ish kind of time period. It's not so long ago that what we're talking about here is in people's minds,
right?
And they're ready for this kind of a king. I would suggest,
right.
And Jesus is not that kind of king. He's very, very different. And the temple, that's a piece of it. I think there's more, but yeah. So. A lot going on here. There's a lot I mentioned to you earlier, and I think we should wrap up here. But there's a lot of things about the story that I wrestle with. The idea of the miracle is I don't know, how to make sense of that really one way or the other, how important it is or isn't, but I'm not concerned about it. I am concerned about how it is that God wants his people to respond to threats. And on the one hand, I think if there wasn't a response, I don't know if Jewish practice and culture would have continued and what that would have meant for the coming of Jesus, et cetera. Very different than this, but I'm also concerned with a completely positive image of, yes, let's just kill people who are threatening us. Because they're in the way of what God wants us to do, and how Jesus responds to that, and again, so I just give that to kind of, if people care to kind of wrestle with this point in history, and I'm actually glad for that reason that we don't consider this the Bible, even though there's other things certainly in the Bible that are very much in a similar path earlier in biblical history. To think about and wrestle with, but that's here. So what are your concluding thoughts, Joe? What do you think about with Hanukkah? Or let me maybe ask you this. So Hanukkah means enough to you to share it with your family and your children, to have that practice. Can you say something about maybe what it is to you kind of stands out about this holiday that's worthy of remembrance as somebody who's not a Jew?
Sure.
Right.
Well,
you don't have to. We don't. I would argue have to. I hope not, because I don't really do a lot with this holiday as people who aren't Jewish. But we are part of that big family in some sense as well. So anyway.
So obviously part of the conversation that you and I have not had is that I am Jewish.
Oh. Okay.
And so I grew up celebrating this holiday with my parents. And obviously that's a big part of the answer to the question.
Okay, that is, yeah. I guess that's too big of a question. So what part of your family?
So my dad is Jewish, and that whole side of the family.
Okay. like actively kind of practicing, or
Yeah.
this is a bigger question.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's
No,
yeah, that's another question. But it's interesting, Judd, that even from what I can tell, a lot of people, regardless of how observant they are, to use kind of that word, that some of these practices are still important to them. There's people that basically they're Jewish to basically say, yeah, I don't even know that God exists, but still kind of keep this practice.
right.
So
Yeah.
fascinating
So, yeah,
stuff.
what we grow up with, what we are exposed to, has an enormous impact on sort of what we pass on to the next generation.
So for you, part of it is passing on a tradition of your family that comes through your father, and you're sharing that with your kids. That's part of it.
Yep.
I imagine.
Yep. And then I think, quite honestly, there's a Berean element as well, of teaching my kids, hey, this history that you and I have just spent an hour talking about is important. The connection between the covenants is important. What God has been doing through the life of his people for thousands of years is important. And so celebrating something that maybe, we're not limiting our faith to here's what Paul said, but saying here's what God has done, so that whether or not God miraculously made one little piece of oil last for 8 days or not, he's the kind of God who could do that. And we recognize the nature of our God, and this is one of the ways that we celebrate him.
Yeah. I mean, with what God has done throughout the biblical history, what God has done in Jesus, compared to that, is this too much for God? Certainly not.
Right.
You know, whether or not it's the reality, it certainly is not too much for God to do, to do that. So interesting stuff. Well, I learned something about you.
Yeah. So I'm going to close our time, if I may, with two of the prayers that are recited each night with the lighting of the Hanukkah candles. If you think I have poor pronunciation of Antiochus, just wait till you hear my Hebrew. But
Hebrew, I can translate first too, or not?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Yeah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadnik ner shel Hanukkah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to kindle the Hanukkah lights. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim la'avatenu bayamim hahem bazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who performed miracles for our forefathers in those days at this time. Amen.
I like that. That's nice. Very nice. Good stuff.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening. Put your questions, comments in the comments below. We'd love to interact more. We covered a lot of ground. We skipped over a lot. There's a lot more to say. So anything that we want to discuss more, let's continue the conversation. Yep. Good stuff, Judd. Thanks so much. I hope that folks are tuned more into this history here. And for me, part of it is I want to understand. I want to understand more about history. I also want to understand more about people that are different than me in their practice. So this does a little bit of both. And cool. All right. Have a great day, folks. We'll see you again when we see you. Probably back to more normal topics next time. But this was fun. Thanks, Judd. Thank you. All right. Bye.